Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Civic Forum. My name is Rory Truex. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Politics and School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. I started the Civic Forum this past summer as a place for people to think about the bigger picture issues facing democracy in the U.S. and elsewhere. And today I'm delighted to welcome an old friend and colleague, Jessica Chen Weiss, who's an expert on China and U.S. China relations. Jessica is the David M. Lampton Professor of China Studies and the inaugural faculty director of the Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. She's a very well-regarded China expert in our community. She also has policy experience. She worked as an advisor in the Department of Policy Planning under the Biden administration. And in our field, she's known as someone who's willing to challenge sort of the orthodoxy on U.S. China and China relations. So thank you, Jessica, for joining me today.
Great to be here, Rory.
I wanted to start really just at the present. We're recording this in late November of 2025, and we've seen Trump's China policy sort of start to take shape over the last several months, culminating with this meeting with Xi, which some have regarded as an embarrassment to the Trump administration in the United States. Some have recalled that it's some sort of maybe potentially a major shift in China and U.S. China relations. What happened with this recent Trump and Xi Jinping meeting? What does it mean for the ongoing trade war?
So at the recent meeting between the two leaders, they basically arrived at some kind of truce. The two sides had been steadily ratcheting up their tariff and export control threats and measures. And when the two leaders met, essentially they agreed that they would defer a number of these measures for another year, bringing down some tariffs, and on the Chinese side, suspending kind of the implementation of, or deferring the implementation of some of these new export control measures on rare earths, which effectively put a pause in the kind of dynamic that could have really brought the global economy to a screeching halt, and put lots of American companies, automobile manufacturers, sort of out of business. And so I regard this as actually a good thing. A lot of people are upset that this was a fight that the Trump administration didn't need to pick, and that what we have instead revealed through the president's actions of escalating and then backing down is that the United States is not resolved, and we're, by the way, super vulnerable and dependent on a lot of Chinese exports or commodities. And so that is not an inaccurate statement, but that really sees the glass as being kind of half empty, whereas I see the glass as half full, in the sense that we avoided economic catastrophe for now, right? I mean, it could of course, like the glass could just like be once again, knocked off the desk, crashed and broken on the ground, and like that could very well happen like any day. And so I'm not under any illusions as to how stable this truce or durable this truce is going to be, but I regard it as better than the alternative.
Well, and what we noticed, obviously, in the first Trump administration is China was a major focus, and shifting what we might call the Overton window, the set of acceptable policy areas for discussion was notable. And it was Trump that ushered in a more tough on China approach, surrounding himself with very notable China hawks, people like Peter Navarro. And so it was Trump that shifted the U.S.-China stance. And in some ways, it's only Trump that can shift it back in terms of the politics of the China issue. And I think there's this bigger picture question of, are we shifting back now? I mean, Trump said the relationship, I forget the language, like a 12 out of 10, and this sort of awkward embrace where Xi Jinping looked uncomfortable and Trump looked enthusiastic. So do you think we are in the beginning of kind of a detente or a softening of the relationship more broadly, or is this just a temporary truce?
I mean, I think that you're right that, Trump is one of the few leaders who could say, I have a great relationship with Xi Jinping. He's a friend. There's hardly a Democratic president or even a Republican president prior to Trump that would have said something like that, because of the fear that they'd be seen as, soft on China. But I think that so long as Trump, remains as powerful as he is, especially in terms of sort of commanding where his own party stands, I think that it could be durable. But I think it's a really important space to watch. Republicans on Capitol Hill continue to push forward measures that would kind of tie the administration's hands as regards export controls. And so, just today saw that the White House has asked, them to not pull that back. So I think that it's a really interesting and open question as to whether or not his party will fall in line, as he's clearly pushed in a particular direction. But even within the White House, there are, Peter Navarro is literally still there. I think there are a lot of different voices. And so on any given day, who the president is listening to, or, whose voice he channels, I think, and empowers, is going to be also a space to watch as to whether or not this is, how long this is going to last.
Well, and I think you're getting at this idea that there are factions within the White House, within the Republican Party, about how to think about the China issue. We have people who are sort of traditional strategic realists, peace through strength thinkers. We have people who think about restraint. We have America first folks, maybe people who are more isolationist. We have sort of pro-business community who maybe wants some standing up to China, but still the preservation of business ties. So you have these competing voices, and from the outside, I'm not really a creature of DC, but I'm observing the signals, and it just seems, to put it directly, just incoherent, right? Like I couldn't even tell you really what our China policy is right now, other than that we tried to have a big victory in this trade war 2.0 that sort of flopped because China, in some sense, called our bluff or utilized a tool in the rare earths that was sitting there waiting to be used. So I just don't even really know what our policy is right now, kind of what are the underlying principles. And that's different from the first time around. I think in the first Trump administration, it was pretty clear we're going to have a maximalist pressure stance towards China. But right now, it just seems sort of a mess, to be honest. But I don't know if that's me just being ignorant of the subtleties of things.
No, I think that most analysts would share your sense of that the polite way to put it is that it's still coming into focus. I think that there are a lot of different cross currents. I think that there are, though, some things that are relatively uncontested and might help us see where the trajectory is going. One is that the United States no longer, as this was true in the first administration, Trump administration, no longer wants to lead the so-called rules-based international order. Marco Rubio's, has explicitly said that this is being used against us. There is, I think, a broader sense the United States is overextended and that the military is not in any shape to kind of bear the kinds of defense burdens that the United States has shouldered for so long. And so there is a broad recalibration. But where that leaves the United States and China, I think, is still kind of to be determined. The United States is still, I think, in the process of kind of reevaluating what is the national interest and what kind of foreign policy serves that goal. So I think there's a lot of flux right now at the moment. And yet I do think that there is maybe as just a result, there's a lot more space for discussion, more than there was, a year ago.
No, and I think if we're going back to this analogy of this Overton window, it's expanded again, right? And you see sort of a broader set of ideas being discussed from all parts of the political spectrum about how to deal with China. I do think there's been a realization that there is an upper bound to American power, and especially with rare earths, the ability of the Chinese government to basically squeeze the American economy and put people out of jobs and destroy whole industries. I don't think there was a full realization of that prior to this year. So I think maybe it's a little bit of a humility. Maybe it's a prioritization. It seems to me that Trump is primarily focused on domestic issues and power consolidation, and China isn't front and center in his mind, and he wants to make sure there's no blowback domestically, but it doesn't seem like that's his major political project this time around.
Yeah, I think the question of what are his domestic priorities? I tend to think that a lot of what we're seeing too, because there is a little bit of self-dealing. That there's, I think, a way in which some of the transactions may benefit him and his associates. And so when we think about, what are the American people getting from this, I think that that's an area where I think, he probably remains vulnerable. Although again, you have to look at the alternative here, which is a continued kind of ratcheting up of tensions and a lot more economic pain. That I agree with you that we are, I think, in a new space as far as a collective realization about just how much leverage China does wield. It may not be at the frontier of the most sophisticated semiconductor chips, but that doesn't mean they don't have real power throughout the economy, and that broader contest or set of capabilities is quite important.
Well, and one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, and neither you or I are economists, so coming at this with a degree of humility, a lot of the shift in U.S. China policy was centered on economic issues and this general feeling that China wasn't playing by the rules and that the American worker and the manufacturing base in this country had been hollowed out by the China shock, China's entry into the WTO, and a lot of the tariffs and all these other policies were designed to restore that balance, bring jobs back to the United States, bring manufacturing back to the United States. And there's always been this debate of, well, if maybe we agree about that diagnosis, but what about the prescription? And is this the set of policies that's going to do that? And I'm wondering, we've been in this different versions of this equilibrium basically since 2016, 2017. How is your assessment of that? Like how has this economic rebalancing really played out?
It's a really interesting space, I think, to watch, because I think for a long time the sense was that they've taken our jobs and we want them back. But a lot of the jobs that were outsourced to China aren't even ones that China necessarily wants, and we certainly don't want them back. Although I think there is this question of, do we want people screwing and like assembling iPhones? Are those the kind of jobs that when we think about the reshoring of manufacturing, is it that, or is it really at the leading edge where many of China's most advanced factories don't even have the lights on because it's all automated? And so I think that the sense of what we are competing over and what is the kind of economy that will both bring prosperity but also future innovation is like an area that I think needs a lot more thought. Right now, I think the political rhetoric is mostly at the level of that is still, I think, is captured by that narrative of the first China shock, and now there's, I think, beginning to be an interesting shift in the conversation around EVs. Obviously, this administration is pretty hostile to renewable technology, wind and such. But on the EVs, interestingly, I mean, I've talked to some folks in the labor community who are like, yeah, we would welcome that if Chinese investment, especially or only if they, were to bring kind of union jobs. And in many cases, I think that Chinese investors would be open to that. And so there is a way in which, continued, the flow of commerce and investment can benefit Americans, and that the alternative, which is to sort of shut China out, is more a recipe for America falling further behind.
No, and again, I'm not an economist, and I have just a relatively thin understanding of how this all works. But my vague sense is that tariffs, it's hard to have the kind of long-term effects that we want them to have. One, because they're being implemented in such a haphazard manner. So if you're a firm trying to make long-term investment decisions, do you anticipate the tariff levels being what they will be in 6 months, let alone in 6 years, right? So how do you decide to build a factory when the tariffs are bouncing around all over the place? Two, they are a tax on the American consumer. And so in some sense, they're depressing people's buying power, potentially contributing to inflation. And third, there are other tools, right? So we can imagine a different approach, which was centered on getting these Chinese companies to invest in the American heartland and build factories and potentially even have joint ventures, maybe share technology, whatever it is. So there's a different approach, which is more focused on carrots and less on sticks and less on tariffs.
I absolutely think that bringing more Chinese talent and investment and know-how here could very much be the kind of shot in the arm that kind of invigorates American manufacturing and technological kind of innovation and leadership. I think we've benefited a lot from the human capital side of that in terms of attracting many of China's best and brightest. But now, unfortunately, the the flow is going the other way as the United States makes it harder and harder for international students to stay and work here after they graduate, with the H-1B changes. Similarly, I think there are a lot of governors who want to bring Chinese investment. In some cases they have, but there's a lot of local scrutiny and frankly, political legislation that makes it harder for those who come here to then buy land and even real estate, right? Like land is one thing, but a house to live in, and then so there's a lot of concern that the reaction against any kind of interaction with Chinese businesses or people is somehow like tainted by association is a real concern that I have, that we're making it harder for Americans to ultimately get ahead.
No, and I'm glad you brought that up. And this is something, that's always been worrisome to me, is that one of the costs of competition, this move towards competing with China, viewing China as a rival, adversary, and some folks even think of it as an enemy, the cost of it has been the people-to-people exchange, the ties between firms, universities, people that underpin a relationship. And that's sort of a cheesy thing to say. But I do believe that those contacts matter. It's important for the Chinese people and the American people to interact with each other, to learn from each other, to engage in science together. And we've seen all of that stuff just drop off a cliff because of what you might call a McCarthyian almost fear of anything coming from China. And I don't want to completely dismiss concerns about espionage from China or the fact that the Chinese government has a united front wing that's designed for overseas influence. Like, we need to acknowledge the issues there. But in my opinion, we've gone way too far in the other direction, and our ability to understand China and advance in areas of mutual benefit has really been cannibalized. And I'm wondering what your sense of that is, and whether or not that tide might be starting to reverse as well.
Again, I think it's complex, and I really agree with you that there are real challenges here. But I think the right way forward is to address problematic behaviors rather than scrutinize a whole category of people or businesses without investigating all of those who might not even be Chinese, but maybe engaging in nefarious acts on behalf of China. So it's like the ethnicity doesn't really. Shouldn't be playing a role. I mean, that very much goes against, the principles of non-discrimination and the civil liberties that make the United States a democracy. I will say that the president has been on the other side of this issue, at least as far as welcoming, for reasons I don't entirely understand, but something like he wants 600,000 Chinese students here in America, but he got really roasted on Fox News for saying that, and so I think that the MAGA camp is very uncomfortable with this. So again, there are different views inside the Republican Party, it seems to me.
No, and a little bit of whiplash on that issue. And I have a lot of students who are Chinese nationals. They're studying political science, so they're not particularly sensitive, and they're engaging in pretty bold research, and they don't know if their visa is going to be revoked, right? We had Marco Rubio earlier in the year say that they're going to aggressively investigate ties to the CCP. There's 100 million people in the CCP. Almost everybody has a tie to the CCP in China in some way. And then days later, Trump saying, "Oh, we love our Chinese students, and now we want 600,000 of them." So it is this sort of I would just call that incoherence and a little bit of whiplash as a result of that. So, Jessica, I want to talk a little bit about Taiwan. This is a complex issue, and just the status of Taiwan is often confusing to people who aren't heavily embedded in national security issues. And so can you tell us a little bit about why Taiwan matters to U.S. foreign policy? And at the beginning of the Trump administration, I was worried that there was going to be some sort of selling out of Taiwan or viewing Taiwan as a bargaining chip, and that could be used in some sort of negotiation, some big grand deal between Trump and Xi Jinping. I don't think we've really gotten there. I think Taiwan hasn't really been on the table as much as I was worried about. But I'm curious if you could kind of give us the sense of where Taiwan policy is right now and why it matters.
Yeah, so backing up a little bit, Taiwan has long been a potential flashpoint between the United States and China. When the United States established normal relations with the PRC, the People's Republic of China, they cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan, and so the United States has had since the 1980s only an unofficial relationship with the island. It doesn't call it a country. It's not recognized internationally as a state. But of course, it's a vibrant democracy and a large economy and one of America's most important trading partners. And the United States Congress and the United States, administrations have said for years that they would treat, any kind of aggression against Taiwan, coercion against Taiwan, as a matter of the national interest, but have declined to say what exactly they would do, if China were to use force, and that's known as sort of strategic ambiguity. Um, the Trump administration hasn't changed that policy. I think actually, relative to other presidents, he's been more ambiguous, in some ways, as you suggested, uh, implied that Taiwan is like the tip of his sharpie, and like China is the size of the Resolute desk. So, sort of downplaying the issue, and therefore presumably the U.S. willingness to intervene. Um, but we haven't seen it kind of be on the negotiating table in some of the worst ways that people feared. There was, in the lead up to the meeting between the two leaders, some actions that the Chinese side asked the U.S. to take regarding Taiwan, including not allowing Taiwan's President Lai to transit the east coast of the United States, and also put off an arms sale to Taiwan. And both of those, I think, led many in the kind of close Taiwan watching community to be enormously alarmed at the direction of travel and U.S. policy. So that we don't know where that's going. I will note that an arms sale was approved, and it suggests that we, are not in as deep of a hole as might have been feared. But there's still apprehension about what will happen in the coming months as the two sides ready a presidential visit to China, and whether that will become a live issue again. My own view is that keeping a kind of steady hand on the tiller here is really important, both for avoiding creating any kind of opening or opportunity where decision makers in China think, well, this is an unusually good opportunity to make a move. And it's also important to avoid panicking those on Taiwan who then might, decide they needed to kind of stir the pot to take matters into their own hands.
And I would just share an insight from a Chinese friend. When Trump came to office, I had a conversation with someone, and he's not particularly nationalistic or patriotic, but he said Xi Jinping would be stupid to not do something now. And I thought that was striking, and I don't know how representative that his thought was of thinking in China on this, but I think there is a feeling of that this is an uncertain time, and would Trump really go to bat for Taiwan? Would the U.S. military intervene? Does Trump really care about Taiwan? I think it's safe to say that this is not an administration that has a normative commitment to democracies or our allies, especially our weak democratic partners.
I'll say a couple of things. One is that I don't think that the Chinese leadership is looking for an opportunity. I think they continue to believe that military action should be of last resort. It would devastate the global economy and the island and their own prospects for modernization and rejuvenation. So this is a highly difficult operation to undertake, and so it's not one to be undertaken lightly, especially when the Chinese leadership is in the process of purging like half the top military leadership. So I think there's a lot of reasons not to be as worried about that kind of opportunistic use of force. And I think that the Trump administration, too, is too volatile to be counted out, right? I mean, you have the military strikes on Iran, what is going on off the coast of Venezuela. I mean, I don't think that the Trump administration is as averse to the use of military force as one they might hope.
No, and I share your general assessment of the politics on the Chinese side, and there's this sentiment among some in DC that Taiwan is on the brink of invasion and that there's a timeline and it might be 2027. Like there's this concern, which you've written about, that this becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like if we view war over this as inevitable, we treat China as we're basically then preparing for war with China, which then oddly might make war more likely. So one thing you've written, which I really enjoyed, I think it was a couple of years ago, was about the idea that we both need to, solidify deterrence, but also reassure the Chinese side about we're not trying to peel off Taiwan or shift towards a stance of being pro-Taiwanese independence. So can you tell us a little bit more about what reassurance means and why that side of the diplomatic piece is really important?
Yeah, so we argue, I, together with Tom Christensen and Bonnie Glaser, argue that assurances are actually a critical part of deterrence. Deterrence, of course, is, wielding the stick and making clear that you're willing to use it. But it's also the assurance that if the target of your threat complies, that you aren't going to bash them over the head anyway. And so in this context, it's the belief in the Chinese leadership that time can continue to progress, as they say, on their side. And as soon as they start to believe that the United States and or Taiwan are kind of inevitably bent on independence and supporting Taiwan's independence, then they don't have the assurance that they need to take a breath and not act today, right? And so the more that they feel that this is an inevitable, that they are going to lose, quote unquote, lose Taiwan unless they act. I should just say that assurance is incredibly important to preventing and deterring China from using force.
And what about assurances to the Taiwanese people? I happened to visit this past summer, and this was right around the time where Lai's potential stopover was canceled. And there was a feeling that Taiwan was being left out to dry and that the U.S. could no longer be counted on. And you could argue that there's been a pretty significant shift in domestic politics in Taiwan away from the DPP, which is generally leaned further away from Beijing and closer to a new party, the TPP, and also the KMT, which both are more middle road, a little bit closer to Beijing in their orientation. And you saw that play out in the youth vote and among other things. And so there is another delicate balance here, which is communicating to the people of Taiwan somehow, when we don't really have formal diplomatic relationship, that we hear them, we understand the importance of Taiwan. Taiwan is arguably the place in Asia with values closest to our own. That's what someone said to me this summer on my visit. I really appreciated that. So how do we assure the Taiwanese people that we understand and we're trying to kind of play this delicate balancing role?
That's such a critical point. And usually when we talk about reassurances, it's to our partners and our allies, and Taiwan's an important partner. And the challenge then is assuring Taiwan without provoking Beijing. You could say that assurances matter in part because you want your partner to also prepare and do things rather than capitulate or submit. But you also want to do so in ways that don't bring about the backlash or the coercion that you're trying to shore and help Taiwan defend against. And so I think that can be, that threading that needle is difficult, but it typically, most, I think, would agree that runs through solidifying the kind of economic and cultural kind of ties and doing what's necessary in the security domain, but in a very low profile or no profile way, which means, not announcing or, waving the red flag in front of Beijing's face and putting them in a position where China's leadership feels that they need to respond. So, that involves, doing things to make it easier to trade and invest with Taiwan, supporting Taiwan's participation in organizations where statehood isn't a requirement. But it doesn't mean landing, high-profile congressional delegations on the island, especially the Speaker of the House, in 2022, Nancy Pelosi landed on the island, and you could say, what did her visit accomplish? Well, so some, I think, on the island were assured this is a sign of American support, but it also led Beijing to regularize the set of kind of, military intrusions across the Taiwan Strait, and in some ways put Taiwan more in a bind. So that's the kind of delicate balance that one has to, I think, thread.
No, and I wanted to share, I asked this question actually when I was in Taiwan to a number of different people because I'm not a Taiwan expert and I feel like it's a huge hole in my knowledge. And I just asked people, how can the US actually support Taiwan? Like, what does healthy support look like? And I spoke to Audrey Tong. Audrey is a genius of sorts, a polymath, a former minister of digital affairs. And I asked them this question, and they had a truly unique answer that I just wanted to share with you and get your reaction. And I'm going to read it. I apologize. This is bad podcast behavior. But here's Audrey's answer. The only way Beijing can take Taiwan without firing a shot is by convincing the world that democracy never delivers and only leads to chaos, which is the authoritarian narrative. In the US, both extremes risk buying into that narrative. If the US fragments culturally or kinetically into civil conflict, this PRC will point to that and move without kinetic escalation. So the most useful thing Americans can do for Taiwan is to foster civic care and civic muscle at home. No democracy is an island, not even Taiwan. Without a vibrant US example, backsliding accelerates globally. And I found that maybe it's because it resonates with my own views, but I really pointing to the fact that like the health of our political system, the example that it has on the world stage is more important than any missile we can ship over there or any statement we can make. And I wonder what you think of her, Audrey's reaction.
First, it's beautiful, and I want to believe it. As social scientists, I then have to think about, okay, well, what's the importance of that factor alongside a number of others. I don't think that. It really runs through Taiwan, which is the health of Taiwan's own democracy, which I think is, faced challenges not only from Beijing, which many will point to, but also from within, and the ways in which they, conduct their own kind of democratic processes is really important. And so if the United States, I worry a little bit about the United States leading by example and putting too much weight on that. But there's no doubt that we have long been, or styled ourselves as a standard bearer for democracy, and so that has to weigh heavily, I think, in others' calculations. The only caveat is that I don't think that the Chinese calculus on Taiwan is much at all affected by whether the United States is a vibrant or kind of muddled democracy. This is an issue of sort of nationalist significance, territorial integrity from their perspective. And so I think that their level of preparation and where they see trends on the island going, not in terms of democracy versus autocracy, but how much distance the island wants to put between itself and the mainland in terms of identity and the symbols of sovereignty. That's, I think, what is going to matter more ultimately. But of course, the judgments about that are a function of these domestic processes. So I think that's a space to watch.
No, thank you for that assessment. And my sense of the answer that I got from Audrey is that it's sort of the big picture story of American soft power, Americans' role in the global stage to show that democracy can still function. But in terms of specific military decisions and conflicts, like, of course, these other factors are going to matter more. I want to turn at the end of our discussion towards the bigger picture of U.S. China relations and what can a healthy, productive relationship between these two global superpowers look like in the years and decades to come. And I want to talk to you a little bit about this shift towards strategic competition. And there's different gradations of this. There are people who believe we are already in a Cold War, people like Mike Gallagher and Matt Pottinger. We are already in a Cold War and we're just naive that we don't realize it yet. And it's leading us towards a hot war. Then there are others who think that this is a rivalry or a competitor nation, but just general views on that's sort of the general range of acceptable views in DC. And I'm wondering, how have you assessed, is this policy, this shift in policy away from engagement, is it is it working? Is it effective? What do you see the wins and losses from that broader shift? And is it time for a shift back in the other direction, either under Trump or in the post-Trump period?
Well, I think that, nostalgia is a dangerous thing. So I think wherever we're going, it needs to be a new understanding. I think there are a lot of costs to the current footing, which treats, again, kind of any interaction with China as potentially suspect. I mean, in some ways that's valid and warranted, given that both sides are looking for choke points and various levers they can use to wield against the other as a cudgel. But I think that if we are to find ourselves in a better place, it will need to run through kind of a high level understanding that these two countries' kind of fates are somehow intertwined, both in terms of the fate of the globe and sort of climate change, but also, whether or not the risks and benefits of AI, how that all shakes out. And, things like if China finds a cure for cancer, are we going to be able to benefit from that? And vice versa. And so it feels to me like most of the most pressing challenges, that will, occupy us for generations to come can't be addressed without, in some way the participation of the other, or we will simply fail to address them. But how we get there then is a real question. And I don't think that strategic competition captures it. There's no doubt that, we don't have the same interests. So you could call that a competition. There are obviously companies that are daily competing with each other, and there are domestic competitors, right? So competition isn't a problem. The question is, do we define the stakes here as ultimately a competition for, primacy in the world? And here I think that the administration's step back from kind of global leadership actually creates an interesting opportunity. But the question is, what will we make of it? If the United States and China both are comfortable with a so-called multipolar world, okay, fine. What does that mean? What are the actual ways in which we interact with each other and other countries? Is it going to be this kind of, everybody with their sticks and hammers and export controls and tariff threats? Or is there going to be ultimately a set of understandings reached that are more durable, that, yes, there are risks, but here's how we manage them. And here's how you can kind of responsibly use Chinese technology in, for example, building out your green infrastructure. And here's how, and similarly on the Chinese side, how they can continue to use, U.S. manufactured semiconductors or designed semiconductors. Because right now the drive is to, keep the other out because it's too big of a vulnerability. But that's very costly, and I think doesn't ultimately create a basis for some kind of, persistent and durable coexistence. One reason I think Cold War analogies are bad, and in fact, I was just finishing a paper on this, is that one, there wasn't just one Cold War. The Soviet Union went through different periods, and there was a period of détente, which then kind of collapsed. But secondly, China's a much different kind of political system and economic system than the Soviet Union. I mean, China today is more capitalist than it is Marxist, even though the state plays a really important role. And the United States is also kind of coming around to thinking that some degree of state intervention and guidance is actually maybe a good thing in terms of industrial policy. So there's a lot of things that are these binaries, I think, don't get us very much. And then the challenge is in the middle, in that muddle, where can we set forth some principles that'll allow us to do better than we are now?
No, and I wanted to plug, I just finished a book by Van Jackson and Michael Breens called The Rivalry Peril, which is all about this sort of fallacies and dangers of romanticizing Cold War and the Cold War mindset. And we can understand why it's attractive, especially in American foreign policy circles, because the U.S. prevailed. And there's this sort of knee-jerk reflex of, oh, we need to just win this one too. We're going to somehow beat China. And I think underneath that is a little bit of American insecurity, and also maybe a misread on the Chinese system. There are people who believe, I think naively, that the CCP is on the brink of collapse, and if the U.S. just puts on a little bit of economic pressure, maybe we could prevail. But I wanted to go back to what you said about coexistence and even cooperation. Cooperation with China is something that has fallen by the wayside in the last several years on things like climate change, certainly AI regulation, and so forth. And I share your sentiment. I think we've known each other for many years, and I believe that we need to coexist with the Chinese state, and that we need to figure out a way that we can work together on the true existential threats facing humanity, whether it's climate change or disease or AI misalignment, whatever it is. But there's also this doubt that I have about what does cooperation look like, and is this a government that we can cooperate with? And part of it is we need to acknowledge the fact that China has changed under Xi Jinping. The human rights record is abysmal in terms of the number of detentions of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, the erosion of civil liberties in Hong Kong. They don't play by the rules economically. They're cozy with Russia. They threaten Taiwan. And Xi Jinping is repressive and has consolidated power around him. So it's hard to argue. I find it hard to argue that this is a government we need to be working with when the government looks the way it does. And so I'm curious how you think about that. And the way I'll tell you my answer, and please reject it or come up with your own. I think of this as a post-Trump, post-Xi Jinping world. I think there's a limit, upper bound to how healthy the relationship can be when these two guys are in power. But it's quite likely that in 5 years, they are both out of power, or at least 10 years. And so what does the world look like then? And could there be a softening of the relationship and a different type of relationship after these kind of authoritarian hyper-nationalists are no longer running the two most important countries in the world? So that's my longer term view. But I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Jessica.
So I don't have any, argument against what you've just said, except that I don't think that the cooperation is largely going to take place with the Chinese government. I think it's about the scientists and the people in civil society and the scholars who, and the entrepreneurs, right? I mean, that's where a lot of the innovation is happening. That's where the scientific breakthroughs are happening. That's where I think the prospects of working together, or at least side by side, I think are the greatest. So I don't think about government to government cooperation, although there's a degree of cooperation in managing risks. That's why we do need effective diplomacy and such, and clearer channels of communication and that sort to avoid mishaps, and whether that's over AI or in the air or sea. But what I'm talking about is in this period before we have a change in leadership. I think it's still crucial that we have and we create frameworks that allow kind of for the responsible exchange of ideas and tech practices, I guess you could say, where we learn from each other, especially since it's not a one-way street anymore, right? Whereas I think before it was like, oh, they're going to steal all of our technology. Now it's like, well, they have a commanding lead in a number of places where we care and want to learn. So again, we need to think about, what does reciprocity look like? How do we manage risks of espionage, etc. But those are, to my mind, manageable rather than existential, and that the real challenges are far greater. So that's what I would say to that.
No, and I appreciate you pointing that out, that when we talk about cooperation, often we're talking about these high-level diplomatic summits and the governments having these big meetings, but really the bulk of cooperation is among the Chinese people and the American people, and that has been what's been cannibalized in the last decade or so. You see it in data, right? The number of researchers going to China and going the other way, the collaborative research, and those are the things that will advance progress on these shared existential threats. So, Jessica, we will leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me today. You can follow Jessica on basically every social media platform, I believe, except probably TikTok. I don't think you're on TikTok, which is good for you. Jessica is working on a book called, I believe it's newly titled Fault Lines,
yes,
which is not yet for sale, but I will flag it for those of you who follow me on Substack. I will flag it when it becomes available for pre-order. And so thank you, Jessica, and really appreciate you sharing your insights today.
Thanks.